I want to jump right into our second session here. Just to give you the quick one-sentence overview of this session. This panel considers three domains that fundamentally shape racial and ethnic inequalities through the life course. Those are education, incarceration, and health. You'll hear about how those link together from our next three panelists. Our first speaker is Sean Reardon. He is Professor of Poverty and Inequality in Education at Stanford University. He's also a Senior Fellow here at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Professor Reardon leads the Education Research Group at the Center on Poverty and Inequality. He's an expert on racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic gaps in academic achievement and educational success. Using cutting-edge methods for big data analysis, his research is regularly cited by policymakers and in the media. And I think it's fair to say that it's widely acknowledged that he publishes the most informative and the coolest charts in the New York Times. Sean Reardon.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's great to be here. I think I've been here at all four of these, and it's always an honor and a privilege, and I always learn a lot by sharing the program with so many colleagues who I admire and respect. So I'm going to talk about education and educational opportunity, particularly with respect to race and ethnicity in America over the last 25 years. And I'm going to sort of show you charts that describe opportunity by using standardized test scores. And I want to make clear a few things up front. First, standardized test scores are certainly not the only outcome we care about with respect to education. As a parent or an educator, we don't think of the end of education as having children with high test scores. We want them to be happy and creative and collaborative and engaged and curious and innovative and empathetic. And we'd like them to know a little math, I guess, along the way, right? But I still think that the standardized test scores, sort of writ large, serve as a useful proxy measure of kind of the quality of educational opportunity that children are getting in America, and the differences in the amount of educational opportunity children are getting in America. So I don't want to reify the test scores, but I still think they serve as a sort of useful measure of opportunity. I also think it's important to remember that children's educational outcomes, whether that's grades or test scores or graduation rates or whatnot, aren't solely the result of things that happen in schools or that schools are responsible for. That is, educational outcomes are, I think, the result of the sum total of educational opportunities that children have had from the time they're born or even prenatally until the time we measure those outcomes. So that includes opportunities they have in early childhood, in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in their childcare and preschool settings, and in their K-12 schools. So the trends that we're going to see in terms of educational outcomes, don't think of those as referenda or measures of the quality of schools per se. They're the measures of the quality of all the kinds of educational opportunities that we as a society provide children, some of which obviously are due to schooling, but much of which the evidence suggests is also due to things outside of schooling. All right, with that as a preamble, I don't know how to, there we go. I first want to show you what the trends in racial and ethnic achievement gaps in the United States look like over the last 25 years. So the best way of looking at this is to look at data from NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, sometimes called the nation's report card. NAEP gives standardized tests in math and reading to about 800,000 children a year, every other year since the early 1990s. It does that in 4th and 8th grade. It does it in math and reading. And so that lets us get a good estimate of the average math and reading skills by race over the last 25 years or so. And what this figure shows you is the trends in the achievement gaps between Black and white students and Hispanic and white students. The white-black gaps are in blue and the Hispanic-white gaps in red. The gaps are measured here in standard deviation units, and and if, which is a thing only a statistician can love. So what is a standard deviation unit? Think of it as about 3 grade levels. One standard deviation corresponds to about 3 grade levels of difference in test scores. So the black, white, and the Hispanic white achievement gaps are quite large. In the early 1990s, the math gaps for white-black gaps were over 1 standard deviation. The reading gaps were about 0.8 or 0.9 standard deviation. So that's on the order of 2.5 to 3.5 grade levels of difference in average performance. But the good news is those gaps have been declining for the last 20 years or so, both for white-black gaps and Hispanic-white gaps in 4th grade and in 8th grade. They've declined by about 15 to 25% over the last 25 years. Now, that's good news, but it still would take more than 50 years for those gaps to go to 0 if they continue at the same rate. So they're still quite large. They're still about 2 to 2.5 grade levels in terms of magnitude, so still a huge difference in the average achievement. But the trend is in the right direction. So why is the trend going in the right direction? Well, certainly one possible explanation might be that white student scores are going down, and black students, Hispanic student scores are sort of staying flat, and so we're making a lot of progress by cutting down the tall poppies, as someone recently described it to me. So that wouldn't be so great, and happily that's not what's been happening. If we just look at average test scores by race over the last 25 years, test scores have gone up for every racial and ethnic group in the United States, in some cases quite dramatically over the last 25 years. They've just gone up faster for black and Hispanic students than they have for white students. And those differences are quite large. So if you look at for example, the math 4th grade scores, the achievement gap in 1990, this is about 3 grade level difference between whites and blacks. Black students today have higher test scores than the average white student did in 4th grade math a generation ago. That is to say, those test scores have gone up the equivalent of more than 2 grade levels for black students, closer to 3 grade levels, in fact, over that time period. They've also gone up for Hispanics and whites a lot, but they've gone up faster for black and Hispanic students in both math and reading than they have for white students. So that, to my mind, is the ideal scenario for how you want to narrow an achievement gap. Improvement for everyone, but faster improvement for those at the bottom. So why has that been happening? What's been going on? Well, one thing to notice is that the gaps have not narrowed faster at 8th grade than they have at 4th grade, and are not particularly smaller or larger at 8th grade than 4th grade, if you go back to this picture. What that says is that none of the action in the narrowing gaps is happening between 4th and 8th grade. All of the action in narrowing the gaps is happening before 4th grade. And in fact, in some other data we've looked at, when we look at test scores of children, school readiness scores when they enter kindergarten, suggests that most of the action in narrowing the gaps over this time period is because black students and Hispanic students are coming to school with higher school readiness relative to what they used to have and relative to whites than they used to. That is, almost all of the improvement in the racial educational gap seems to be due to changes in opportunities kids have before they get to kindergarten. There doesn't seem to be much change in the sort of post-kindergarten years. Maybe a little bit, but not a lot. So the action is largely not in the schooling years, but in the preschooling years. We hypothesize that much of that might be related to improved preschool and child care opportunities. There's been a big expansion of preschool over time. The last point I want to make is a different one, and that is what in general drives these achievement gaps? Well, there's 2 big factors. One is white and black students and white and Hispanic students come from families with very different socioeconomic backgrounds. As a result, they can afford to live in different kinds of neighborhoods and have lots of different kinds of opportunities. So this shows the white-black difference in socioeconomic status, that is differences in income, education, occupation, and so on, between whites and blacks. 0 means whites and blacks have the same average socioeconomic condition. Each of these dots is a school district in the United States. And the vertical axis, again, is an achievement gap. You can see there's this strong relationship between the achievement gap and the amount of socioeconomic disparity between whites and blacks. Importantly, though, even in the few communities in the United States where there's no disparity in socioeconomic condition between whites and blacks, there's still a large achievement gap, about a third of a standard deviation, about a grade level standard deviation. That suggests more than socioeconomic differences drive the achievement gap. This pattern is basically the same for the white-Hispanic gap. The other thing to notice is that the largest gaps, some school districts have gaps that are 1.5 standard deviation. That's about 4.5 grade levels difference. So places like Atlanta, Washington, D.C. have enormous achievement gaps and enormous disparities in the socioeconomic conditions of folks. So if it's not socioeconomic conditions, what else is going on? Well, the other big culprit is racial segregation. So here we have a measure of the amount of segregation in a school district. This is a measure of the extent to which black children go to schools with much higher poverty rates than white children. So 0 means white and black children go to schools in that district that have the same poverty rates. 0.5 would mean black students on average go to schools in that district with poverty rates 50 percentage points higher than white students. So these are very segregated places by race and income. And segregation is highly predictive of the achievement gap. In fact, by itself, segregation is the strongest predictor we have of achievement gaps. And in every model we run, this remains a strong predictor. So that suggests we're not going to be able to eliminate achievement gaps without both reducing segregation, but the key way to reduce segregation is by improving the socioeconomic disparities between white, black, and Hispanic families so that they can afford to live in the same kinds of neighborhoods, afford the same kinds of schooling opportunities. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. Becky Pettit is professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Pettit is an expert on the racial and ethnic inequality invoking effects of mass incarceration and the criminal justice system more broadly. She's recipient of numerous awards, including Best Paper Awards from the American Sociological Association sections on both crime and on law. She's one of the first social scientists to document the consequences of the racially unequal rise in mass incarceration for employment and the life course, publishing several landmark articles in the early 2000s. Welcome, Becky Pettit.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to back this up. I just want to say thanks for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me. I am honored and humbled to have a conversation about mass incarceration in this space. And I want to acknowledge my co-author, longtime collaborator in the back of the room, Brian Sykes. Here. And the key point I want to make, which may be very familiar to some of you, is that the sheer scale of criminal justice contact among Black and Latino men make it a central concern for accounts of inequality in the United States. That's it. That's one really important takeaway. You might have heard a lot of talk lately about mass incarceration, and I want to frame this central observation in the context of some things that we've been talking a lot about lately. And the first is, this figure just illustrates crime until perhaps the last year, maybe two. Crime has been on the decline for the last 20 years. So this, I'm not sure why this is auto-forwarding, but crime has been on the decline for the last 20 years. Measures of crime, both violent and property crime, reached their peak in the mid-1990s, which coincidentally was when I started working on this field. But we've seen declines in crime by pretty much any measure since the mid-1990s, such that by the mid-2010s, so into 2014, crime rates rivaled those in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think the key observation to make here is that mass incarceration is not about crime. Mass incarceration is about shifts in policy that have led to differential surveillance, differential prosecution, and differential sentencing that have disproportionately affected certain subgroups of the population, most notably young African American men with very low levels of formal schooling. I also want to acknowledge that there are some areas in the country and some neighborhoods where crime and violence are unconscionably high. Exposure to trauma is a routine aspect of life. But nationwide and in most jurisdictions, crime has been on decline for over 20 years. I also want to frame this in the context, there's been a lot of talk about criminal justice reform. In my home state of Texas, where I live now, this started even in the early 2000s. The Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act was a bipartisan initiative, didn't pass in the end, but a bipartisan initiative that led to, or that emphasized the value of potentially important things like community policing and sentencing reform. And so there have been reforms, there's been lots of talk of reform at the federal government level, and there have been reforms at state and local levels that have emphasized community policing, limited or ceased prison and jail construction, and led to sentencing reforms. I want to just note a few headlines about my home state of Texas. So in 2014, in February of 2017, and most recently in May of 2017, Texas has been identified as leading the way in criminal justice reforms. And I just want to say, I'm relatively new to Texas. I've been there 3 years. There's a lot I like about it. But I'm also spending a lot of time observing in prisons and jails and courts. And I'm having a hard time reconciling it as the model of reform with what I'm seeing. It still has the second largest prison population, and there is massive racial and ethnic inequality in contact with the criminal justice system. Incarceration is just one dimension of that. And 5 million people in the state of Texas every year get some sort of criminal sanction. So in the state of Texas, even a speeding ticket is a criminal offense. And as you can imagine, the system is vast and extensive. But all of this, incarceration has declined in the last, since the peak of incarceration in the United States was in 2008, 2009. And at that point, 2.3 million Americans were in prison or jail. That's 1 in 100 American adults were in prison or jail at the end of 2008. Now it's 2.2 million. 2.2 million. So we went from 1 in 100 to 1 in 115. And the Sentencing Project estimates it will take 75 years of decline at this rate to reach pre-epidemic levels. So I want to put this in comparative historical perspective. And just say, we have left out from these slides the peak incarceration time in the United States, end of 2008, beginning of 2009. So the US incarcerates a much larger fraction than any other advanced industrialized country. Sorry about this. And we did so in 1983, in the early years, even more so in 2001, even more so in 2008 and 2009. But even now, with the declines, the incarceration rate in the United States is dramatically higher than in these other countries. But for the purposes of today, incarceration is disproportionately concentrated among young men, African Americans and Latinos, and especially those with low levels of formal schooling, such that in 2015, 9.1% of non-Hispanic Black men between the ages of 20 and 34 were incarcerated on any given day. That's 1 in 11. And I just want to ask a question. If 9% of young white men were incarcerated on any given day, what would the policy conversation look like? And incarceration is also intergenerational. So there was another slide which showed, and you can read it in the paper, that there are approximately 2.5 million children that have a parent incarcerated on any given day, and that is also concentrated. Exposure to parental incarceration is concentrated among African American children, and so that 1 in 10 African American children on any given day has a parent incarcerated in federal, state, or local prison or jail. Now, I want to just say a couple of things in closing. One is that incarceration, in my mind, is just the tip of the iceberg. There are 2.2 million people incarcerated in prison or jail. There are another 4.7 million under formal surveillance of the criminal justice system, and over 20 million people are arrested in a given year. So this system is vast, and it is disproportionately concentrated among those with low levels of education and among people of color. So I want to just end with, despite decades of declines in crime and much talk of criminal justice reform, incarceration and criminal justice contact more broadly are a central axis of racial and ethnic inequality in the United States.
Thank you, Becky. Apologies for increasing the degree of difficulty there on the slides. Our next speaker is Rutger Johnson. Rutger Johnson is Associate Professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Johnson is an expert on the effects of growing up poor and poor infant health on childhood cognition, child health, educational attainment, and later life health and socioeconomic success. His PhD thesis in economics received not one, not two, but 3 National Dissertation Awards in 2002. He's a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and in 2012 was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences here at Stanford. Welcome back, Rutger Johnson.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here and honored to be among such a distinguished group of both presenters, and thank you all for coming. I think when we turn to the topic of health disparities, so we turn to the issue of racial health disparities. Certainly, racial health disparities are profoundly large. They appear to widen over the life cycle and are very suggestive of an important role of childhood conditions. At age 25, there's a 5-year life expectancy gap between blacks and whites. And more than half of that disparity in longevity is due to higher prevalence of risk factors related to cardiovascular disease. When we think about cardiovascular disease, deaths related to heart disease are almost 2 to 3 times higher among blacks relative to whites. We see that every 7 minutes, a black person dies prematurely in the US. That translates to over 200 black people dying daily who would not have died if the health of blacks and whites were equalized. Now, this isn't just driven by individual level and contemporaneous individual family level factors. In fact, white high school graduates who did not attend college live longer than blacks with a college degree or more education. And so while these health inequalities have been well documented, they're not immutable. They are not the product of genes, but the product of our policies and our history. And so I am going to summarize some work that has the aim of looking back to point the way forward. The argument here is that the keys to unlock healthy development and best promote health equity lie in the historical evidence on the long-run effects of some of the key policy interventions of our time. And part of that has to do with this biosocial model of racial stratification that begins in childhood, but over an extended period of time, the degree of segregation, the degree of socioeconomic inequality, the concentrated exposure to poverty and violence leads to high allostatic loads that lead to greater risks for coronary heart disease, inflammatory disorders, and cognitive impairment. And so what I do to study this role of childhood conditions on adult health is to first document the proportion of current adult health disparities that are rooted in early life factors, and document the dynamic complementarity and human capital investments, and to highlight which particular childhood, family, and neighborhood factors matter most. And to do this, I'm analyzing the health trajectories over the life course of people born between 1945 and 1975, but who've been followed through 2015 through the nationally representative panel study of income dynamics. And importantly, I'm going to use the introduction of Medicaid and its rollout as a shock to early access to health insurance coverage, using a difference in difference approach and estimating, therefore, the long-term returns to Medicaid spending and how much it narrowed racial health disparities. And then I'll close with implications for contemporary policy. Now, this work comes from the panel study of income dynamics that spans more than 4 decades. We're talking about over 13,380 children, the oversample of Black and low-income children, and then attaching the residential address history so that I can characterize the childhood conditions that prevailed when they were growing up. The key results are, first, we document that hypertension and diabetes rates are 2 to 3 times higher among Blacks, but that explains their higher burden of cardiovascular disease, which is the leading cause of death in the US. But importantly, that these racial health disparities are driven primarily by racial differences in childhood conditions, that parental income, access to child care in childhood, neighborhood poverty, and other child, family, neighborhood factors are instrumental in narrowing these gaps, that we see and document significant childhood Medicaid spending effects on long-term child health and adult outcomes, including reductions in the incidence of low birth weight, improvements in child and adult health, increases in educational attainment, increases in income, reductions in the annual incidence of poverty in adulthood, and all of those pieces collectively significantly reduce racial disparities. When we look at the cumulative mortality hazard over the life course, and in this work, I'm focusing on Black-white differences primarily because for other racial and ethnic groups, I don't have sufficient samples, sizes, to look at racial and ethnic differences for Hispanics and Asians. But when we look at the kind of race differences in the mortality hazard, as shown here, and particularly looking at those differences in some of the leading risk factors for mortality, like the onset of hypertension, we see that those things open up, where by age 50, more than 3/4 of African Americans have been diagnosed with hypertension, more than double that for whites, okay? But importantly, when we compare Black and white children or adults who were exposed to the same childhood experiences, the same childhood conditions, that is, when we control for the child, family, neighborhood factors, neighborhood poverty, family income, parental education, the kind of extent of concentrated crime in the neighborhoods, et cetera, from birth to childhood, we just focus on those factors alone, that when we look at the hazard of the onset of hypertension, we see differences that are in green much closer to what we actually see for whites. That is, when whites and Blacks are exposed to similar childhood conditions, we actually see the racial health disparities are much, much smaller. In the case of the cumulative hazard of onset of stroke, heart attack, or heart disease by race, we see the Black-white differences here between Blacks and whites are enormous. But again, when Blacks and whites are exposed to similar childhood conditions, we see no distinguishing difference in the actual onset of stroke, heart disease, and heart attack by race. Now, what's remarkable about this is that these differences that we see rooted in childhood conditions, when we compare contemporaneous socioeconomic factors like education and income in adulthood to try to account for these adult health disparities, racial health disparities, the contemporary adult socioeconomic factors account for relatively little of the gap, whereas the childhood conditions account for the vast majority. And I'm going to, again, looking back to point the way forward, to look at the long-run effects of childhood Medicaid spending using the introduction and staggered introduction of Medicaid implementation to look at long-run impacts. What's important about this is that the greatest Black-white convergence in various dimensions of health over the life course occurred for cohorts born between 1965 and 1980. This period coincided with the rollout of Medicaid, school and hospital desegregation, and Head Start. Each of these policies substantially improved early life health and led to educational investments that in turn narrowed opportunity gaps between minority and poor children. And these policies remain very important today. We can see that in Medicaid, for example, that covers roughly nearly 44 million children, covering one half of low-income children. Now, what I do, again, to go back in time, first to frame, this is a map that has a similar geography of the concentration of poverty as was presented in the early session. But what's different is that the concentration of poverty in terms of the levels was much more acute. In the dark red, that's counties in which more than 45% of households are poor. Okay. Now, the timing of Medicaid implementation, while it was part of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, there was a staggered timing. So I'm going to show you a map of the staggered timing because what I'm going to use in terms of the research design is the timing of Medicaid implementation and cross-state differences in Medicaid eligibility that were benchmarked to pre-Medicaid state AFDC levels. I'm going to use those as variation to isolate child health insurance coverage differences across cohorts. So this is the map of Medicaid implementation 1965. That's the rollout. This one state, 1982. They were late comers. Okay. Oh wow. Okay. I don't know what happened here. Okay, so there's a little graphical issue, but what you should see is that pre-Medicaid implementation, there was substantial state AFDC rate differences, and the Medicaid eligibility parameters were benchmarked to these state AFDC rates. So you would have children that were otherwise similarly poor, but grew up in states with very different Medicaid eligibility. This is for all children, but because Black children were disproportionately poor, their state AFDC rates are an order of magnitude different. So what I'm going to be doing is using that state variation in the generosity of Medicaid eligibility to then exploit the staggered introduction of Medicaid across states, the cross-state variation of Medicaid eligibility, and to isolate the causal effects of access on these outcomes, comparing children in areas where Medicaid isn't available with children in those same areas after Medicaid became eligible. So it's really the changing availability of health insurance coverage beyond the role of parents. And basically, what those results show is not only did post-Medicaid cohorts have significant increases in their public health insurance use, but the increases resulted in significant increases in educational attainment that were much more profoundly improving among children from high eligibility states. So we don't see this kind of significant uptick, though in the pre-Medicaid rollout period, basically a similar trend leading up to the Medicaid rollout. So in sum, because I'm out of time, the take home is that what we see from this is that racial health disparities are not immutable. They're strongly influenced by education and health policies that influence childhood conditions. We see significant long-run returns to Medicaid spending that did reduce racial health disparities, and that the racial health disparities in adulthood are driven primarily by childhood, family, and neighborhood factors. And in conclusion, let me just say that I think what's very clear about some of this work is that contemporary policy should consider the long-term educational, health, and economic benefits of these improvements in infant health that came through Medicaid in light of the present contentious debate surrounding its potential repeal and replacement. Thank you.
Okay, if I could ask Becky and Sean to please join Rutger on the stage. We'll have about 15 minutes for panel question and answer period. If you have a question, again, raise your hand. And as a reminder, please tell us your name and where you're from before you ask your question. Yes, in the very back.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shaw from the AlphaWorks Foundation, and my question's actually directed primarily to Professor Reardon. It has to do with education and the commoditization of education in our day and age. We've seen how the high school diploma today does not hold the same value as it once did. In fact, many are saying that the undergraduate degree today is the high school diploma of yesteryear. And in fact, in order to become competitive in the job market, you need an advanced degree. And with this increase in the the level and the standard that we now need to be competitive in the job market, I think I've seen an internet meme that says if you're not part of the solution, there's money to be made in prolonging the problem. And I think we're seeing people trying to get out of poverty and find great jobs. And we're also seeing this huge uptick in student debt and student loans and institutions, educational and financial, profiting on people who are trying to increase and improve the value of their lives. So I guess my question is, if you don't mind just speaking to that commoditization and how it impacts poverty and inequality, and how those of us who are solution-focused and driven can remedy that issue. It's a lot.
How much time you got? So it is a great set of questions. I'm not going to try to do justice to it, but a few thoughts. One is, since the early 1980s, when the value of a college degree relative to a high school diploma started to grow dramatically, as a result, families have gotten more and more anxious about their children's education and those that have had resources have started to invest more in it. And so that has had the effect, in some ways, of exacerbating inequality, because it means that differences in the resources that families have start to sort of matter more because of it. But that only happens in a world where we think of education as a private good, primarily. That is, we think of it as something you invest in as a parent for your children, or you invest in as an individual for yourself. In a world where you think of education as, at least in part, a collective good, a communal good, which is in part how, as public schooling got started in the United States, the idea of the common school was the idea that a functioning democracy, a liberal democracy, needs a well-educated polity. And that part of what society needs is a good education system for everyone. That's a very different frame than thinking of education as a private good that everyone sort of purchases. And I think what you've seen over the last few decades in the United States is a move towards thinking of education increasingly as a private good that one buys for themselves or for their children, and less rhetoric and less policy that frames it as a collective good. And so in a world where you think of something as a private good and you have high individual and family level inequality, you're going to create sort of necessarily high levels of inequality in the opportunities and outcomes, because you make it something people can buy. So the answer to that is to think about how to reframe the conversation about education as a collective good, and then to think about what policies follow from that. And they are not policies that make it easy to make money off of loans to students in community college, or that think about school choice and things like that. It's policies that think about how to make education opportunity good for everyone. I don't think that's the conversation we're having right now, but it's what we should be having.
Now, I would just add that I think segregation is one of those areas in which what can be good for an individual is actually, in the long run, very detrimental for the collective. And I don't just mean for poor minority families. I mean overall. And if one looks at the multiplier effects that begin in childhood, if we took a long frame to examine the ways in which segregation undermine equal opportunity, then this kind of focus on individual level kind of returns to education that are individual focused misses the collective impact of equal education opportunity pursued over the longer frame.
In the back? Yes.
Hi, for Professor Johnson. My name is Donald Barr. I'm a physician and a sociologist on the faculty of the medical school here. Are you familiar with the growing research on cortisol levels in children raised in high circumstances and the fact that cortisol in childhood can actually trigger atherosclerosis. And it's actually been picked up by age 18. There's actually proven atherosclerotic changes that first looked as though it was affecting black teenagers more than white until they controlled for socioeconomic status. And it actually was socioeconomic status, not race. So it actually is starting to cause atherosclerosis by age 18. So does that tie into your work?
Yes, I planted you in the audience because I needed an expert on the neuroscience that could amplify what I'm trying to examine with the quantitative data. But the theoretical underpinnings are built on exactly that evidence. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Sarah Chamberlain with the California Budget and Policy Center. I had a question for Professor Pettit. I was just thinking about the connection between your talk and the session before, looking at prime age employment, black men in particular. And I was wondering, are there data that show, because you talked about the percentage of black men who are incarcerated at any point in time, but what about the percentage of all prime age black men who have some record of incarceration or other criminal record that might make it hard for them to become employed?
Yes. Yeah. So I've done work on that. Brian has done work on that as well. And we've looked at the lifetime risk of incarceration. And one of the things that we find, and African American men are much more likely to spend time in the way that we typically look at it is spending at least a year in prison. So that ignores all other types of criminal justice contact. But if we look at just spending a year in prison, the estimates suggest, somewhere between a quarter and a third of African American men will spend at least a year in prison nationwide. And now I want to just, the last data we have collected nationwide to answer that question comes from 2004. And so, we have almost a generation where we'd like to get some more information about what that lifetime risk looks like. There's reason to think it might have gone down, and maybe more so in some groups than others. But that's the kind of estimate that we have. And I think the other thing that I just want to point out with that is that we see large racial differences in the lifetime risk of incarceration. We also find other work shows large racial differences in the lifetime risk of arrest, say, for example. There's some data that speak to that. But we also see this deeply concentrated among those with low levels of formal schooling. So, the most recent estimates that we did suggested that over half of black men who didn't finish high school would end up in prison at some point before the age of 35, which is when most first incarcerations would happen. So yes, there are data that speak to that. I would like to have more recent data to update those estimates.
Right here, right by Sarah, the previous question, yes.
Thank you. My name is Gilbert Mouchan from Davis, California. Professor Riordan, did you explore how the charter school movement will impact disparities?
I haven't specifically, but there's been a lot of research on charter schools, and the best studies of charter schools, ones in which they look at students who have won or lost a randomized lottery to get into a charter school or not, find that on average, students in charter schools perform about as well as students in traditional public schools that they would have gone to in the absence of going to the charter schools. But that zero masks an enormous amount of heterogeneity. There are some communities where the charter schools seem to be much better than the local public schools, and a roughly equal number of places where the charter schools seem to be considerably worse than the local public schools. What I take away from that is that charter schools are kind of like schools. That is, they're variable in quality. And so blanket statements about the quality of charter schools versus traditional public schools aren't particularly useful. The places where charter schools do seem to be more effective tend to be some of the big cities that have well-developed charter systems, New York City, Boston, places like that. There's some evidence that in those places the charter schools are better. But on the whole, the number of students attending charter schools and the size of the effects of even the kind of average charter school in places that they're pretty good isn't very large relative to the size of the racial and ethnic achievement gaps. So in my mind, what we need to do is learn sort of what makes a community and its school system provide high educational opportunities for all children. And in some cases, we might learn those lessons from the charter sector, and in some cases, we might learn those from things that happen in early childhood, from high-quality preschool programs and parent engagement programs, after-school programs. Some places we might learn it from the traditional public schools. That is, I don't think we're going to find a single sort of silver bullet, but we should look for the lessons about what improves opportunity where we can find them. And to the extent that we can find some of those in some charter schools in some sectors, then I think that's a place to learn from.
Yes, right here.
Thank you for being here today. My name is Elizabeth Softkey, and I'm an executive director of a literacy nonprofit in nearby Redwood City. And I wanted to ask more about your research in the correlation between younger black men and their not finishing their education, dropping out or being pushed out, whatever, before high school, so not getting the high school degree. Have you looked at the reasons for that, besides poverty levels or access? Because I think of my experience here in the peninsula at the educational system, the public educational system, where a lot of things happen to poor kids and boys of color that pushes them out their educational experience. And if you've looked at that data.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of work that looks at that and various dimensions of the school to prison pipeline and differential discipline in schools and how that may affect African American boys very differently than other groups. And early dropout. I mean, there are a couple of things that I am interested in and focus on. One is differential surveillance, right? I mean, you end up in the criminal justice system if you're surveilled, and you only get caught if you're surveilled. And so one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that young white children and young African American children use drugs at about the same rate. But young African American children are more likely to use them in public spaces, they're more likely to be surveilled, they're more likely to get caught, and when they're caught, prosecuted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important what's happening within schools, what's also happening outside of schools. And one of the things that I've been really struck by in the state of Texas, when I first moved there, Texas had a truancy law. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. So Texas prided itself on the decline of the juvenile justice system. It fell 75% in a very short amount of time, partly because it was under federal surveillance. But at the same time that the juvenile justice system shrank, the truancy system grew, such that by 2014, 115,000 Texas children were served summons to appear in adult court for missing school. 115,000. So the legislature, in their wisdom, they rolled this back, and so the law changed. But one of the things I've been most struck by, I've been observing in courts trying to get a handle on these legal fines and fees that are assessed through the criminal justice system. And so one of the things that I've been most struck by in some of the very small districts and very large districts in the state of Texas are children who are pulled out of school and they have to appear in adult criminal court for missing school, essentially. So they miss school, and then they have to miss school, and they go to court. So I went to court one day to observe what I thought were adult hearings, and I saw all hearings of children as young as 12 for missing school. And in one of those hearings, a clerk threatened a parent with sending a child to jail and said, well, he's 18 now, so he was brought in when he was 17, but he was 18 now, and so jail is on the table. Legally, it's not in this case, but the mom didn't know the difference. And so, I mean, there are so many dimensions whereby people are brought in, and it disproportionately absolutely affects children of color, and boys in particular.
Right here in the back of this intersection.
Hi, my name is Mary Fallon. For 11 years, I was a court-appointed child advocate as a volunteer, and that gave me an inside look into a lot about poverty, and I grew up poor myself, and also into the incarceration system. So one question I had was, incarceration is expanding, crime is decreasing, and people will conclude perhaps that more incarceration, the better, because the crime rate goes down. So I think explaining why that's not really the case would be a really helpful for the general public. And I'm also very interested in the fact that one of the children I mentored, and I still mentor even though he's now 27, and I started with him when he was 5, he's going through all the horrors, including going to jail for strong-armed robbery because he got into a fight over a cell phone when he and his buddy were drunk on beer in front of the police station. So he did 3 years in federal prison, not allowed to get his high school diploma because he talked back one day to a guard. And he is now living a really tough life despite all of my efforts financially and otherwise. And I just think that kind of issue needs to get better addressed, and I would love to see all of this research come together in a holistic policy statement of some things that people like us can advocate for, get involved with, provide more sense about to other people, because when they hear all of these disparate studies, I think it's hard to understand, okay, so now what happens? But I'm also sort of baffled by an incarceration system that focuses only on punishment and not on education to stop the problem. And I watched Darius struggle, and he got help in state prison, but not in federal prison, but he had to go to federal prison because strong-arm robbery is a federal crime, even when you're 18. So I just wanted to voice my sort of personal experience as somebody who came up real poor and struggled to get an education, and somebody who's been trying to help other people to do that. And I'm just so frustrated by what's happening to those kids' lives. And, I would appreciate some kind of sort of holistic meshing of all this great intelligence. And okay, so now what do we do? That's my question.
So, yeah, well, thanks for that, and thanks for your work. So a couple of things. So mass incarceration sort of started the ramp up before the increase in crime. So the policies and practices that were put in place to fuel mass incarceration started in the 60s, early 70s, trickled across states and localities. And one of the things that we have observed in those states where we've seen the biggest declines in incarceration, we have also seen the biggest declines in crime, right? So the evidence, did I say that right? Yeah. Yeah. So what that suggests is that, decarceration or reducing incarceration is not going to lead to increases in crime, or hasn't in the states, the states where we've seen the biggest declines in the size of those, or the number of people incarcerated: California, New York, New Jersey, Texas, Florida. In some places it's been larger than in others, but we've seen declines in crime, and the bigger declines in crime in those states. So sort of the crime incarceration argument, I want to unpack it, because incarceration is not about crime. The more people we incarcerate does not reduce the crime rate, right? And there's plenty of work that suggests that, in fact, it has very negative consequences in the long run. So I think it's important for us to understand that and to decouple those things. Mass incarceration was driven by shifts in policy and practice that disproportionately affect certain subgroups of the population. So that's important to understand, I think. I think the other thing that I just want to point out, so it used to be, back in the 70s or 80s, you could get a GED if you were incarcerated. You could actually go on and do some continuing education if you were incarcerated. I lived in the state of Washington for a long time, and Washington Department of Corrections had, a relationship with the community colleges in the state of Washington, and so there was education in prisons or jails. One of the consequences of the expansion of the criminal justice system is that it's more expensive. There are more bodies to house, right, and to surveil. that have other needs. In the state of California, one of the big ones is the provision of health care. And so, and yet we're not spending a lot more money, certainly not proportionally more, to then also think about things like job training and education and how it is if and when people do encounter the criminal justice system, how might they be released with, thinking about reentry and reintegration and be prepared for jobs and other things. And so I think this is one of the consequences of such a vast system, is that we're spending more and more dollars just to house people and less on programs within prison or jail that might be beneficial in terms of reintegration after incarceration.
I would just add, it's a classic case of diminishing marginal returns, that once you're at a certain point, certainly maybe in 1980, an increase in incarceration may have led to a reduction in crime, but certainly, 20 years later, the bang for the buck in terms of crime reducing power of that instrument is not in any way close to the same kind of crime fighting tool it once was.
Well, thank you for your insightful questions and your insightful responses. It's approaching time for lunch, and so I just want to tell you that lunch will be served in the foyer, and feel free to eat inside the building, or there's also a courtyard with benches outside that you can feel free to enjoy. We will reconvene here promptly at 1:15 p.m. Thank you to our distinguished panelists.